You've seen X go from Jack Dorsey to Musk, so that's changed X. Zuckerberg has had this come to Trump moment. Across left-wing parties across the world are having behind doors meetings saying this stuff is killing us. We have to pivot and reinvent. So that's my sort of overarching case why woke broke in 2024.
If you've ever wondered why woke broke, whether it is broken, what is going on with the massive Trump-era cultural upheaval happening in front of our eyes, and how to find hope in the new global chaos, you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. Today, I have none other than Mark Sayers on the podcast. We are going to talk about all of that and more. One of my favorite interviews I've done in a long, long time. If you're enjoying it, I'm sure the comments are going to be interesting on this one. Like, subscribe, leave a comment to join the conversation. Please listen all the way through because Mark has done a lot of thinking. He's kind of got a neutral point of view, but it's going to make a lot of us think. I think you're going to enjoy it today. We're going to get right into the conversation, but first, a word from today's very carefully chosen partners. Today's episode is brought to you by 10 by 10. Well, like me, you know mentoring the next generation matters, but making it happen, well, you got a lot on your plate. Plus, how do you do it well? Well, that's why our friends at 10 by 10 created a next-gen simple mentoring program. It's a free resource, turnkey, designed for leaders just like you to equip the adults in your church with simple, everyday steps to love young people and point them toward Christ. Simple mentoring moves beyond the cost, time constraints, and overcomplication of launching a big new program and provides a simple way to encourage the adults in your church to build on the relationships with young people they already know. Teens need mentors, mentors need training, and you need next-gen simple mentoring. To access your free next-gen simple mentoring toolkit, head over to simplementoring.org today and download the Simple Mentoring Jumpstart for senior pastors. It's good for young people, it's good for adults, and it's good for communities. That's simplementoring.org. This episode is brought to you by The Chosen. Hey, you probably have heard about the explosion of The Chosen as a viewing choice, not just for Christians, but for so many other people. And it tells the story of Jesus' ministry through the eyes of people that know and follow him. Now, maybe you didn't know, the newest season of The Chosen, season 5, is back for Holy Week for a 3-part theatrical release. That's right, in theaters called The Chosen Last Supper. So here's the details. It starts with people welcoming Jesus to Jerusalem as king, expecting a revolution, which most people did. And there, besides them, is a group of leaders who will go to any length to ensure that this Passover meal is Jesus' last. The Chosen Last Supper is in theaters now. It's a must-see event for this Easter season. So you can get your tickets for all 3 parts today at thechosenlastsupper.com. That's thechosenlastsupper.com. Well, Mark, it's great to have you back. Welcome back to the podcast. I couldn't imagine. I've been very excited about this conversation because the world is changing so quickly, and we're going to go there.
Yeah, it's on my someone who follows these trends. My head is spinning.
Yeah. Well, I was telling you before we hit record, I've been sharing your podcast, which, by the way, I highly recommend. Rebuilders, if you're not subscribing, leaders, get on it right now. And I mean, you'll vary the topic, but you've had a few episodes over the last few months that just kind of chronicle what, I don't think it's hyperbole, is kind of a new world order that's happening in front of our eyes. So, let's just start there with what is happening in this cultural moment, because it feels like the world we grew up in is slipping away, if not gone. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah. I mean, I think often you'll have people who track a trend, artificial intelligence or an ideology or something that's happened in the world. But really, we're living through a moment where there's just multiple epochal changes happening simultaneously. We're seeing a new political order, which I know we're going to dig into, happening, in the Trump administration, but not Trump. I mean, I think, we have the, as of recording, we have the German election, I think this weekend, could see massive change there. The political systems across the world are radically being reshaped in entirely new ways, which changes things in a domestic level, domestic politics, but international politics. We're seeing, economic change in the world. There's a lot of big economic questions hanging over this moment. Wars, potential of wars, geopolitical shifts, great power competition. And then you're seeing this massive technological change, particularly around artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and then there's also this weird, almost spiritual change happening in the world as well, like turning on to, sort of God in a new way. So all this is happening simultaneously. And it's like, there's almost a change from, if you've gotten used to, it's almost like everyone's sort of necks broke in 2014 to 2016 around, seemingly what was a new world, the rise of populism, woke versus conservatism. But now it's almost like that world's changed again. So, there's a lot of people who adjusted for the 2016 to 2024 world, and now it's like changing again. So, yes, just a cascade of change in the world.
Yeah, and I think what's significant, I mean, this isn't a political podcast and yours isn't a political podcast, but this is a cultural podcast and it is a leadership podcast. And I think, I got a background in history and political science as well as law and theology. I have never seen things change faster in my life. And as you say, layered change. It's technology, it's politics, it's war, it's peace. I mean, I don't want to timestamp our date of recording too quickly, but if you look at what's happened from November 2024 to Q1 2025, it's almost, a quantum shift. So why don't we break it down? And why don't we start with Trump? Because he is redefining how politics is done and a whole lot more. And again, for those of you, who voted on both sides of the U.S. election, it's mostly an American audience here. Don't just tune out because you heard a word here or think that somebody's coming to stroke your partisan side. That's not what Mark and I are doing here. We're just trying to understand the nature of the shift that's happening before our eyes. So do you want to go there? Why is Trump's second presidency significant?
Yeah, I don't think it's a good point. Like, I think, for me as an Australian and maybe as a Canadian, we look at this differently. You look at a country perhaps less which party you're part of because you're not part of them either. Trump won was a shock. Trump got in and it was a surprise. I even think he was possibly surprised, and Trump too is a completely different entity. Trump won, the image of Trump was sort of a chaotic White House, in a sense, many parts of the civil service and even his own sort of cabinet perhaps fighting him on things. But really what we've seen is now it's less about Trump, which is something really fascinating about this. This you're hearing JD Vance, you're hearing Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK. There is this complete, I would call it a revolution of moving into the various government agencies and either sort of shutting them down and restarting again, like, USAID. There's talk of the IRS being shut down, just stuff that would have been utterly unimaginable, if you'd said this 5 years ago, 12 months ago, even in Washington. So, you can get a sort of like in Trump 1, it felt like, the president got in, we'll go through 4 years of unusual times, but then everything will click back because really government's about these institutions which outlast presidencies. Right. This is radically transforming institutions. So, what struck me about Trump too, and, you saw it at the inauguration, was you have the Pentagon power aligning now with Trump, with Pete Hegseth, and people being sacked. Wall Street swung around and a lot of the big, like Wall Street figures got behind Trump. So that's Wall Street power. Silicon Valley, which is probably one of the big plot twists, swung from almost being oppositional to Trump to being at the front. Like senators and Congress people were moved back and they were sitting at the front, Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk and these people. The fact that Musk is almost sort of, I don't know if he's an eminence grise or a sort of, priest regent in this administration. Like I've never seen a sort of citizen have power like this, which is really interesting. And, so you've got all of these things plus the legislature, the Republic. I mean, he hasn't got the whole obviously there's still Democrats in the legislature, but the Republican Party is his party now. So I think we have to realize that this is an alignment of so many of the different institutions of power. There's very little opposition to Trump. And also even allies, which formerly were, Canada, Australia, all of a sudden we're asking the questions, where do we fit into this? So this is...
Or do we?
Exactly. This is just a radical reshaping of the political order at every level. And that flows down into the culture. One thing I've been saying, I started, in my early 20s at a Christian culture magazine here in Australia. And we'd write about that Beastie Boys album and that concert and that movie. And I'd go and write stuff about movies, and I'd go to movie premieres and stuff like this. And almost at the time I felt like, it's these cultural things which shape the culture, that album, that fashion trend on the street. But I think now I realize that, no, it's actually the trickle down of these big changes which reshape the culture. Silicon Valley coming behind this is already totally changing the culture. So that's what's very different this time. And the speed of achieving things. And really, we may come up with this, talk about this more. It's the Silicon Valley mantra for a long time has been move fast and break things. We're now seeing that in government, and that's totally new. Democrats, Republicans have always been about reform, really, with government institutions, slow change over time. That's out the window now. So this is going to be an incredibly consequential, world-changing presidency.
It's sometimes hard to see it in the moment, Mark, because you kind of look at it and the way you frame it is interesting. Like, people could see 2016 to 2020 as an aberration. He won once, now it's back to normal. But what you're seeing is an acceleration. And I've heard you on your own show use language like this is semi-feudal, semi-junta, like a revolution, like a coup almost a little bit. Can you describe that a little bit more? Because I think you're right. The president is holding court, and many have come to the court, whether that's Mar-a-Lago or whether that's the White House. And again, the goal here is just to understand, because when you're in it, like, having a degree in history, 100 years from now, historians are, if there is 100 years from now, are going to look back and go, oh, this is what happened, kind of like the Great Depression in FDR, the Civil War in the United States, the American Revolution, the founding of Canada, key moments in world history, that kind of stuff. And when you're in it, you don't really know what's happening because there's so much smoke, so much dust, so much debris. And you're like, I'm just going to watch Netflix tonight. I can't keep up. So I want to frame it. What is going on with the massive reframing of the executive and power, et cetera?
Yeah. So like when, America was founded, it was one of the few republics in the world, in a world of kings and queens. And there was always this sort of uncomfortability. Early on, they were like asking the question, do we call the president His Majesty? Because if they're going to go and meet with that king in diplomacy, and other kings just were looking down on the American president because they were seen as a commoner. And that meant that the American system, that the president had more executive power than, say, the Australian prime minister or the Canadian prime minister. The British tradition comes that there's sort of, the British, killed the king, Charles I was executed. And so there's a lot more restraint on the leader of our respective countries compared to the US. But the sort of protocol has been in the US of, even though the executive has less much power, they still allow the legislature to be sort of the voice of the people. So despite having tremendous executive power, it's not always exercised. That's a political norm. Now, there was a moment, time, say, for example, during both World Wars, during the Great Depression, FDR did a lot of executive power, and it was almost his sort of rationale was, unless I do this, we're going to turn like Germany, because of the effects of the Great Depression, into Nazis. They saw what was happening in Italy. They saw what had happened in the Soviet Union. And it was sort of this idea, we'll exercise some executive power, but we're doing this in order for a little period. It's a pause, and we'll return to some normality. And interestingly, conservatives have defined themselves against that. Like many conservatives, FDR is sort of like this figure who centralized government and made government too big and created this welfare state, which had to be sort of like wound back because of the fear of centralized government. But what we're seeing is just an incredible flexing of the executive, office here in the United States. And there's this moment when, I said on my show, and what struck me, it was less a political event as it was Trump appearing at the UFC. And, if you think about the UFC, is this sort of mixed martial arts fighting. And, he came out and it was a packed arena and everyone was cheering. And he came out and he sort of had his entourage around him. And it was like Kid Rock was there and Elon Musk. And, these are not your normal political figures. I think Mike Johnson, the speaker, was there, but he looked completely out of place. He was this massive sort of buffed up guy. And then, came and he hugged Joe Rogan. And when, I can't remember the guy who won, but the guy who won the fight was, an American fighter, and he sort of gave his belt to Trump. I looked at this, I'm trying in all my understanding of political norms, I have no framework for this in anything I've seen in my lifetime. The framework was not even something 20th century. It felt medieval. This was like the king coming down in a jousting tournament, with his sort of, his warriors around him and it sort of felt feudal. And, I know it's like people go, it's a fight, but I think there's something symbolic in that, in the cultural change that's going on. And so this is a more king-like, and even yesterday, I know we're not time bound with the podcast here, but the White House sort of trollingly put out a picture as obviously AI, but it was Time magazine. And I think it was "Long Live the King" of President Trump with a king's crown on at like an oil painting out front of New York. So there is this definite sort of like, political conundrum that's always been in the United States is the president like a king? And I think that's actually bubbling up. That's a contradiction in the American system that bubbled up in this moment. So that political norm of not exercising that power is gone. And that just extremely strong exercising executive power is reshaping things faster. The reason it feels so fast is because of the power flexing of that. Whereas previously things had to move through the legislature and civil service, and it felt things were slower. So again, this is just a radical shift.
Yeah. And, Trump made that comment to Christians during the election campaign where he says, vote for me, you'll never have to worry about this again. Do you read anything into that? Or, it's one of those things where a lot of my American friends are saying, read The Art of the Deal. This is what he's doing. He's just being very chaotic. And then he goes after, like, that's the position on Canada. It's like, we're just going to threaten, blow everything up. But what I really want is this, and then you'll give it to me. Any thoughts on what's going on, just so that we're aware of what might be shifting before our eyes?
Yeah, so I have read Art of the Deal. And
I have not.
What I noticed is someone who, yes, is a deal maker, is very instinctive, doesn't read books, does that. But also in that, and again, too, this is not, also talks about, plotting to, commit adultery, you know what I mean, as part, so there is an element where there is, yes, that's true, but there's also a deceitfulness in elements of this approach, which is very different. But I think, again, this is what I'm saying. My sense is if Trump all of a sudden, came to, disappeared out of the picture, I think this goes on. This is a political movement that we've got to ask is, why is this happening in other countries? And more what I've been doing is less, I think that's Trump 1 thinking, Trump presidency 1 thinking. But you look at the worldview of J.D. Vance, you look at the worldview of Pete Hegseth, you look at the worldview of some of the people behind the scenes who are what I'm doing is I'm reading, that policy paper that person read, or that article they read about the importance of that northern passage above Canada when global warming happens, and China's going to take that unless we do. So we're going to take Canada. So there's a lot of geostrategic, political, economic thinking, at a high level. And it's really interesting. One of the things I pointed out to see the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is the growing concern of Steve Bannon. And I actually think there's 2 wings within Trumpism. You've got a Steve Bannon wing, which is Trump 1, which is economic populism. We're concerned about the Pennsylvania white working class who've lost their jobs because of globalization. So let's get our man in the White House. Versus Trump 2, Turbo America. We need Canada because we need her power, because we're going to build an AI super state. And, we're going to control the Western Hemisphere, and we're going to get people to Mars, and Silicon Valley is going to be part of that, and Wall Street. There's actually 2 visions within Trumpism now. So partially what I've said to people is the culture war as we've known it is over, but we're entering into a new culture war, which is a polarization within Trumpism. And that's not fully formed yet, but it's happening at an elite level, and that's going to trickle down.
You have another thesis which I'd like to explore. You argue that 2024 is the year that perhaps woke broke. Can you unpack that for us, Mark? Did woke broke? Did woke break? That's what I'm trying to say. And if so, why? How? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. So, we saw the emergence in 20, I mean, you could trace it back, but really what it was a sort of popular version of, you could trace it back to French critical theory, post-Marxism, but in a very popular form, which entered into the culture. And, other people like the philosopher John Gray would say it was hyper-liberalism. So you go back to when America emerges as the sole power in the world after the fall of the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden has global dominance. You have this first phase, which is sort of George Bush, bringing in his mind democracy to places like Iraq, and advancing American sort of values in the world. But then as time goes on, it's like the liberal part of that becomes even more hyper. So we go from sort of advancing sort of liberal values to advancing, what people would call is sort of woke values, and increasing emphasis on identity politics. And it's less about, I often say to people, it's less about the goal, like there's this strategy and tactics. So you may have strategy of ending racism or ending sexism. But the tactics of this was to do that in a particular way, which is to have a particular moral vision that in the world there were sort of these micro powers, and these micro powers had to be rooted out. And they could be that having that particular dish of food is a form of cultural appropriation, and that must be removed, or, that Marvel movie must have this particular representation. So it's sort of, an interesting sort of left-wing commentator yesterday who's, very pro and ending racism, ending poverty, ending sexism, say that basically we tactically got it wrong, that all this has done is create a massive backlash, and we still need to go for those goals, yet the way we were trying to get there was wrong and actually counterproductive. And that all this focus on things like, she made the argument that all this focus on things like, structural racism, it didn't change structural racism at all. It just changed some TV shows and advertisements and stuff like this and created a backlash. So, bring that comes in, that sort of values is embraced by first, really, it's in the popular culture on the internet. You have things like Gamergate, which was a battle in the gaming world around female representation, but that's where cancel culture and this sort of stuff takes off, spreads into the culture, is taken by corporates, is adopted by Silicon Valley, and then goes into HR departments of big corporations and local government, and then government. And that spreads all across the world, particularly with emanating out of the United States. And despite its presence in your country and mine, I don't think it would be in your country and mine if the United States didn't exist, if that makes sense.
Fair. Oh, yeah. So, we're an echo. Yeah, we are.
Echo the culture, and but then something happens, and I think there was already a backlash. People were already talking about this. There was frustration happening, and there was sort of a traditionalist backlash against it emerging in certain places. Trump won, Presidency won, was a backlash against that. But then what happens, I think what was astounding is the elites, for whatever better term to call them, or the people who are currently in power, we can define that a bit more. I would define them as neoliberals. So in other words, that's people who believe in a free market, but liberal democracy. But I think it's Nancy Fraser calls them progressive neoliberals. So they were people who were actually economically right, but quite left in their social values in terms around gender and sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. Less interested in helping poor working class people or the homeless necessarily, but, particular identity issues. And then what you have is a complete misreading of that elites of what was happening in the popular. So the Trump election result is just this catastrophic blow. The predictions, again, were completely wrong.
Yeah, the predictions were, 50.1 to 49.9, and that didn't happen.
And you saw a swing, as we call it in Australia, a move towards the Republicans in almost every single demographic, even in Democratic states, almost every single demographic. One of the best results amongst, different minorities. Like it was shocking. And I was shocked at the extent of it. I had this funny intuitive sense that it might happen, but even my rational brain was, pushed down because, I was reading these analyses. So what happens is that happens, and you see so quickly a realignment of power. So a few things. So number one, how has this new moral order continued? Number one, it's going to be political. Well, that just changed. The electorate voted against it. Number two, it's going to be corporately held. The corporate big businesses of the world, from your big investment firms to big companies who had DEI initiatives, all of a sudden that all goes. So what that means for, I said this in Australia, what that means is there was an article here in our local financial paper that McKinsey, the local branch of McKinsey Consultants, had removed DEI stuff. Why? Because in New York, they would have removed it. So there's this trickle down that eventually in Canada and Australia and all over the world, that stuff is going to stop. So the corporates are backing away from it. But then the third thing is that so much of this was also continued, sort of propped up by Silicon Valley, the algorithms of Silicon Valley. You've seen X go from Jack Dorsey to Musk, so that's changed X. Zuckerberg has had this come to Trump moment, and even he sort of said in his little video about this, he said, previously we've stopped discussions about things like immigration or gender. We're not going to do that anymore. Translation, the algorithm was pushed this way. We're now going to twist it back. So you're seeing even TikTok now is changing. So you've seen the things which were propping this up, business, government, technology, are now switching back. So that means to hold sort of woke positions, for want of a better, the social benefits are gone, the supporting structures are gone, and it's going to be really hard. And there's also a sense, as much as people might go, have the Democrats learned, I'll tell you now, across left-wing parties across the world are having behind doors meetings saying this stuff is killing us. We have to pivot and reinvent. So that's my sort of overarching case why woke broke in 2024.
Why do you think? Because, when you study history, generally, an era takes a generation. You look, for example, the difference between the end of the Second World War, the 50s, and then the 60s, where you have sort of the hippie, rock and roll, protest movement come on. That's a decade, 20 years in the making. This is months. So I'd love for you to comment on the speed.
I think that one of the main reasons for the speed is the internet. And, you think again to like making an album, just so there's a generation defining album to be made in 1968. It's going to take you a year or 2 years, from conception to production to getting that thing out, touring, getting it into the charts, getting it into the culture, a book, similar processes. So the speed of change was much slower. But what we have now is this global interconnected brain, really, that which also some people wait for that to speed up. That's one of Musk's visions. So I think that's what's happening. The other thing I would add too is the West is in a very weak position at the moment. It realizes it's all of a sudden in a great power competition with China. So America's in a great power competition with China. And the reason Silicon Valley switches, I think, anti-woke is not because all of a sudden they've become traditionalists. It's because they began to start to ask the question is all these initiatives and these employee backlashes against that issue, is this slowing down our ability to compete with China? That's, I think, the decisive thing. So there was this realization in Silicon Valley over the last couple of years, like, this is killing us. Like I think it was Jamie Dimon, I think it's JP Morgan, there was a leaked, I think it was him, there was a leaked thing of him talking about work from home and, people not coming to work and having mental health days and all this stuff. And he just was railing against, saying this is killing us, and I can't remember, apologies if I'm wrong, but all of a sudden the leaders going, we've got to beat China in AI, quantum computing, missile production. This stuff is not going to help us in that, that's that conversation's in Britain. That's like the West is going, if we continue in this way, there is a significant reduction in our capacity as a country as a whole. That's, I think, the ultimate driver of the backlash.
So I want to keep going on some of the changes we're seeing because, believe it or not, we're not done, leaders. There's a lot to talk about. But what I want to pin right now is the massive shift in values. I was really surprised. Pick on Mark Zuckerberg. That's somebody who for years said, I am about XYZ, is now having dinner at Mar-a-Lago like, hey, man, everything's good, like turned on a dime. And I think about being a people of faith, right? If you look at the position of first century Christians up against the Roman Empire, it's sort of interesting. And I'm not making direct parallels here, so save yourself in the comments there. Don't bother. But I'm just wondering, when you referenced a book, I forget what it's called, about, it's not virtue signaling, but you say something publicly but believe something privately.
Quran.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think for pastors, it's really interesting. Like, I would like to be the same, hopefully I'm growing, right? So there's more Holy Spirit in me 10 years from now than there is now. But I would like to think that my fundamental beliefs and values aren't going to shift because the political order shifted. But when you look at the business and tech world, you see what appears to be the opposite. And you also see some churches really going sort of in a rubberneck direction too. Oh, we were about this, but now we're about that. And I'm just wondering, like, from an integrity standpoint, I have a hard time with that. I'm just wondering what your read is of why we see so many people switching allegiances, and even forget the allegiance, value systems overnight. It's almost like a version of the deconversion that we're seeing over the last 10 years. The evangelical movement used to believe this, don't believe this anymore. We're seeing that at an unbelievable rate right now. What's behind it?
There's three things. So one, Tim Karan wrote a book some time ago, and he's a Turkish, I think, sociologist, and I think it was called Public Lies, Private Truth. And he used the example of, during the communist era, in a lot of shops, I can't remember, it was like Czechoslovakia or something, they would have this like little sign in the store saying "Workers of the World Unite," which was their way of aligning with the Communist Party. And then all of a sudden, when communism fell at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, everyone just removed them, and so sociologists went and asked them, like, why did you have that up? And we didn't believe it. And, we just had it up, because you had to. And he makes the point that so many of our public facing values are often transactional, or they're not really what we believe in private. And I think that what's happened with the internet, there's two elements to the internet. There is your public facing Instagram or Facebook or X account. But then there's been this growth of your WhatsApp group, your text message, and you hear this commentary now where people say, on the thread or the text chain, we were saying this, but they're putting up that. And this began to happen. So this has happened across the culture. It's like these little, so in communism, and again, I'm not comparing to communism, it's very different. But, in communism or a totalitarian regime, you might get some people you trust and have a very quiet conversation where no one can hear late at night in your kitchen around the table. The version we have of that is these text message chains in Signal or WhatsApp or Telegram. And that's been going on. But you can't see that. There's no way to measure that. And because we get a false read from social media, we think that's the conversation. Social media is not the conversation. The text chains are the conversation. And that's all. So there's like a below the water, above the waterline.
The book, by the way, is Private Truths, Public Lies, Timur Karan.
Timur Karan, yeah. And I read that, I think, in 2015, 2016, and I just thought, okay, so a lot of what people are saying is not true. And I just remember, I've got to be very careful how I say this, but I remember meeting a couple of people who were very vocal in the public sphere about woke issues or seemed very progressive. And then when you spoke to them, they were like, look, I don't really believe this stuff. And
You had those convos. Wow.
They're just like, I've got to do this for my job, just like there was quality assurance or professional development, sort of trends that came through in the 90s. This was the new one, and they just saw this as, and even cases where people were doing in their private lives the opposite, and we saw that on the flip side. There's a famous member, I think it was a Hungarian politician who was like the family minister for, I think it was one of the parties in Hungary, who then was, busted with let's just say a private life, which was the complete opposite of that. So this has always been, we've known for many years the conservative politician who is busted for, having multiple affairs or something. This is just the other version of it, the super woke person who's not really doing that. It's about career. So there's also this very cynical thing. And a lot of people saw the Musk actions going, this is about money. And I think it is. There's an element that there isn't a thing where a lot of these Wall Street people jumped across, or Silicon Valley jumped across, because this is what's best for the bottom line. But I also do think that, I read there was an interesting article in the New York Times about Zuckerberg, and this reporter, spoke to a lot of people in his circles, and the feedback that this reporter got was, this is genuine. If you look at the trajectory of someone like Joe Rogan, they've gone on a journey. Joe Rogan is the biggest media thing in the world at the moment, like
Yeah, he is.
megastrophically a large audience compared to someone like, CNN. We see this. Like
I've run the numbers. It's staggering. It's something like 11 million listeners per episode, viewers per episode for Rogan. I just did a talk on this to a media group, and 700,000 for CNN. And I want to come back to that. But like, when you think, is Rogan that big? Yeah, he's like more than 12, 13x over some of the cable news networks.
Which is amazing. And he's gone on a journey, from, I think he sort of voted Obama, or, sort of like a sort of left-wing, sort of, libertarian guy. And he's gone on this journey. And a lot of people of Silicon Valley, and conversations I've had with different people, sort of in that scene, say that's what's happened. You've seen this journey. It's not just political, it's spiritual, it's lifestyle. There's this massive change that's happened. People are saying it's just men. That was the interesting thing. Like in the election, people were saying, young men have swung to the right and women haven't. Well, actually, young women swung to the right as well. And not as big numbers, but there was a swing in every demographic. So I think that people in the last sort of 10 years have gone on this epic journey, and you don't see it until you get like a marker like an election. But the conversation that people were having when populism arose was, it's the boomers, it's the old people hanging on for 1950. I just literally read an article about what's happening in Germany, and you had young people defending the far right. They're the ones joining the AfD. That's where the energy is. And then they said, we'll talk to the opposition. The opposition were literally called grannies against the far right. And it was like an 84-year-old. So that sort of mental paradigm, which first we thought was just Europe and the English-speaking world was different. The thing that's changing as well is the cost of living crisis, housing. You've got a young generation who has no hope for the future, that they're going to have, the social contract for them is broken. So that means that they're incredibly ideologically flexible. Last point, I read two reports from, I think it was the head of Australian intelligence and the head of British counter-extremism. And they said the same thing, that they're now struggling to deal with. So like after the war on terror, if you wanted to fight terrorists, you would go to some, radical small mosques, which were sort of jihadist and Salafist, and you could go to certain places and find these guys. And that's who your terrorists are, because they follow this radical ideological, framework. What they're now discovering is there is this utter flexibility. So they're discovering people who are like, they become an Islamic radical, and then 6 months later, they're a far-right Nazi. This is the mind-blowing thing. They're finding people, like there was a couple of them recently who were like white supremacists who are not white. This is a growing thing. Many of the white supremacist accounts on Twitter are run by people of color, which is just mind-blowing. I saw an interview in Australia of a far-right group, and they were interviewing this guy, and he's a Sudanese Australian guy who's a refugee. And they're asking about refugees. I'm against migration. And you're like, this is so bizarre. And I think, so what they're finding is they're having to come up with this new framework because people are spinning their ideology so quickly. And if you think about what the online world has done, a feed is this highly fluid environment. If you're scrolling through X, it changes all the time. And it's like a radicalization machine at hyper speed, but it can throw you in different directions. The algorithm can change. You click on something, you get down that rabbit hole. You click on that one, it's another rabbit hole. So the ability of the internet to radicalize us in directions at extreme pace. The original idea for that was like, I'm going to get you to buy those Nike sneakers or buy that property over there. And I remember reading a book by, I think it was Douglas Rushkoff, like at the end of the 90s, he was saying a lot of the sort of brain imaging machines in New York were being, rented by advertising, companies on Madison Avenue so they could understand how our brain reacts to certain stuff. We've got 20 years of that now. These are the smartest people in the world trying to get you to buy stuff. But that technology is now used by political ideology as well. So they can make people flip on a dime. I mean, one thing that's really surprising me with the deconversion thing and evangelicals is what we're seeing here in Australia is the reconversion thing. We're having conversations with people who just come up and go, because my sort of thought was in the 90s, had lots of friends who did this and, early 2000s and just didn't come back to church. So my thing is if someone's done that, it's highly unlikely to come back to church. We're getting people turning up to church and I have the conversation, I deconstructed, I deconverted. I'm like, okay. And I'm sort of preparing myself for some argument. But now they're like, I'm coming back and rebuilding. And they're sort of, coming back. And it's not like they're coming back as some sort of progressive liberal. They're like coming back sometimes more engaged in their faith than before. So even I'm like, you've got to rethink this, Mark. There's a lot more flexibility and change happening at a rapid point. So flexibility and adaptability is going to be key.
I want to keep going on the cultural changes, but I want to get to your new work is on moving from platforms to pillars, and just put a pin in that for a second that we can come back to, Mark, because, and I agree with you. I mean, if you listen to Rogan, you listen to Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO, they're talking about their spiritual journey. Tim Ferriss Show, another one of the biggest podcasts in the world. Tim's way more open spiritually than he was 5 years ago, definitely not a Christian. But like there is an openness now and a movement that is fascinating. But for Christians themselves, right, you're arguing we need anchors, we need pillars, we need people whose convictions don't shift with the wind or the sand or the tide. And, literally, when it comes to our faith, for those of us who would say, no, I've followed Jesus, Christians died for this stuff. Like we're literally burned at the stake over the centuries over, I'm not going to kiss the ring or I'm not going to do this. So it raises all kinds of issues, but I want to keep going because we're not done with the change. You also, I've heard you say, politicians are now acknowledging that the economic system is broken. I'll give you an example. Literally 2 hours ago, I was talking to a guy who moved from California to Montana. He moved there 5 years ago and he bought a lot of acreage. And he said, literally, my property value has tripled in the last 5 years. And I know people in ski towns and resort destinations that are off the grid. We're not talking the coasts, just like who everybody's priced out of the market. Unhoused homelessness is through the roof in North America. I was really impressed with Australia. You guys don't have much. And I was there a year ago. You figured that out. We got to all take notes. But people can't afford anything. I'm looking at, so I'm really cheap on some things. Windshield washer fluid. You need a lot of that in Canada. In 3 months, it went from $3.99 to $4.50 to $5 in the cheap stores. It's like, what is that? The price did not just go up by 25%. Something's going on here and people are losing faith and, forget housing, cars, everything is super expensive now. And, you're preaching to people who'll be, I'll never own a house. I'm going to rent. We're going to become multifamily. I'm going to have a roommate till I'm 73 years old. Talk about the economic system. Is it broken? Are politicians acknowledging that? Again, another thing that's happening rapidly, because we keep thinking we'll snap out of this and we'll go back to the way it was. Everybody can have a house. Everybody can live indoors. What's going on?
So I think this is also got to be seen as one of the things driving a lot of the political change at the end of the day. I also think woke broke because people don't want to talk about sort of what's to them feels like esoteric identity politics issues when I can't pay for eggs or windscreen, windshield wiper fluid. Yeah, I mean, okay, so one thing that's radically changed in the economy is a shift. And this is why people like Steve Bannon want to go back to sort of 1950s and 60s, the economy of industrialization, of not having jobs go overseas, is, a couple of things happen. One is globalization. Globalization was seeing the entire world as a market. So, the sort of deal was, well, we'll move the car factory out of North America to Mexico or to, China. And yes, some factory workers will lose jobs here, but the benefit is your car will be cheaper. However, there's a price to pay. That was good for wealthy or upper middle class people, get a cheaper car, but it's not good for working class people. And, you had a backlash against that. So what you've seen is the ability of working class people who formerly would work in industrial jobs in the West, is the gap between rich and poor is growing. So that's one thing. That then drove a world where you had this world of financialization. What does that mean? Complex word, but so important to understand is instead of making stuff and being productive from making stuff, we gave that to China. And that enabled China's rise, and China could make cheap stuff. So it felt like we were getting richer when we weren't necessarily getting richer. It's just that TVs cost not that much different from 20 years earlier, is we started making money from the selling of financial products. So all of a sudden, the city of London, New York, Wall Street, the global economy became around really finances and money that could come from finances. In many ways, that sort of fell in on itself in the global financial crisis in 2008, when some of the stopgaps that were put in back in the Great Depression were removed, and what the Great Depression put those stopgaps in so you wouldn't have another financial crash, but we had one in 2008. So you had this problem that we're not producing stuff. The economy is not producing stuff in the way that we used to. If you produce stuff, that makes you, a growing economy. It makes you wealthy. But we were just basically making money from financial products. That goes. And also that began to accelerate housing as a way of wealth. So, for example, if you've got a house, my wife Trudy bought the house 2 years before we got married. It's a humble house here in Melbourne, and it's just astronomically gone up. Now, in a sense, it doesn't help you anymore because, if I had to sell this house and move somewhere else, the other houses have gone up. But it makes you feel like you've got money. Well, this is how much I have as an asset. Now, that makes you feel good if you own a house. But the problem is with rising generations, they don't own a house. So in a sense, a lot of the reason that the housing market went up because the mortgages that you have on your house is then sort of cut and spliced and diced by banks and sold around the world in these sort of like almost mystical financial arrangements where money's made on the debts and so on. Now, what happens is 2008, there's the financial crisis. So one of the reasons that governments dealt with that is we started doing stimulus, quantitative easing, printing money effectively. So it's like an adrenaline shot, like to get a heart going that it stopped. We did that. And it's sort of like there was an effect, but it sort of got things moving again. The problem is COVID happens and there's another financial shock to the level of the Great Depression. People forget that. Like everyone remembers lockdowns and masks and so on. But there was a massive economic shock globally to the level of the Great Depression. The reason we didn't feel it economically like the Great Depression is we started printing money again. You can only do the adrenaline shot to save your heart so many times before your heart gives in. And that's where we are now. So what's happening in countries like the United Kingdom, the United States is people have this expectation of this is the welfare that I need. This is what we're going to spend on our military. This is what we're going to spend on public services. But because you're not producing like you used to, and this financialization model of the world is not working like it used to, we're borrowing money. So the US debt has just risen at an absolutely astronomical number. Now, as interest rates then went up because of COVID, because printing money eventually is inflationary, all of a sudden, this sort of beautiful worlds where we had globalization, America controlled the world, you didn't have a trade war, so things from China was cheap. All of a sudden, that's changed. Globalization's changing. So this sort of incredible seemingly period from, maybe the early 90s to 2008, and maybe pushed into 2014, where we were all far more prosperous than we realized, that's gone. So even if Elon Musk, I heard an analysis the other day, someone broke down the numbers, even if Elon Musk just slashes incredible amounts of, corruption and expenditure or whatever he finds it with through his Doge initiative, it's still not enough to pay back this incredibly massive debt that the US has incurred. The interest payments on that alone, I think, are possibly already bigger than what's being spent on the US military. Britain, Labor gets in Britain, and Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically looks at the books and realizes Britain's essentially broke. So you have a population who the sort of social contract, we will follow you, we'll obey your rules, we'll have investment in this country because I can get a house, I can get a hospital bed, etc. That's radically breaking down now. And we're only at the beginning of this. So, something I ask, like something I posit is if you're pro-Trump or, think America's now in a different place, It's going to be really hard for Trump to deal with this debt issue. This is his biggest issue, and how do you get that down? You either do it two ways. You start to become incredibly productive and make a lot of money, or you cut services. The hope that they're hoping, the $1 million sort of bet, or not $1 million, $1 trillion bet is that Silicon Valley and AI and quantum computing will bring about a massive productivity boost. Now, the problem with that is, just say that happens, that's also going to see a massive industrial revolution scale of displacement of people from their current workplaces. So that would mean lawyers gone.
Oh, yeah. Lawyers, accounting, wiped out and unrecognizable.
Yeah. So the audience is probably already punch drunk of the amount of changes.
Yeah. We're going to get to hope, guys. Okay, just hang on.
But overwhelmingly, the economic system as we have it now is not working. China realizes this. China's looking at different economic models. It's playing with different stuff, and it's got this dual circulation economy that they're calling it. But no one has solved this problem, and no one wanted to talk about it really in the US election. Both sides were ignoring it. But you see, I think it was Mark Carney who's running for the Justin Trudeau's party. Came in and said, Canada, it's going to get worse. Keir Starmer came in and said, Britain's going to get worse.
Our productivity is tanking. It's just awful in Canada. Yeah, we'll know by the time this airs what's happening in our country. So
one more thing.
Yeah, please do.
I forgot to.
But wait, there's more.
There's more. The other thing too is we have plummeting fertility crisis across the world.
Yeah.
So, people are not having children. And interestingly, that's even a lot of people say, well, if this economic problem was dealt with, if people could buy a house, they'd have more children. There's increasing data coming out that that's not true. And it's even happening in countries where people have got access to housing and stuff like that. But that also means that the GDP of your country rapidly goes down.
As your population ages, right?
As your population ages, because you're going to pay for more, elderly services and so on. So, the economy is a significant issue, and people are going to have to experiment. I'm hopeful that there's a solution, but there's going to be pain to get to the solution.
Why do you think fertility is dropping as much as it is?
It's a fascinating thing that not enough people are talking about. I literally heard, I think I said this on our podcast the other day. You think of these ancient civilizations, the Carthaginians, who Rome destroyed, and they don't exist anymore. And this person was basically saying, think of some of those ancient people. Well, soon Japanese people are going to become that. Koreans, Italians are not going to exist in a few generations.
Like literally will be extinguished.
No Japanese people on Earth, in 4 generations. I don't know the exact thing. Korea is basically, and Japan, not going to be sustainable as a country in a generation. And, the answer, people go, well, we'll do large-scale immigration. The problem is a lot of the countries that we're bringing people from themselves are now starting to go through a fertility crisis. We do seem to have something that, there's different reasons. Paul Morland is an interesting writer on demographics, written a lot about this. People haven't got to the solution of it. But I do think some of it's economic, some of it's lifestyle, some of it's, I think, hope for the future. But part of the problem is that as the economy improves, it starts to kill fertility. Seems to be the simplest problem.
The richer you get, the fewer children you have.
Yes.
And our relative level of affluence is significantly higher, despite all of these problems we're talking about. You go back 70 years, at least from my reading, the average American actually has much more than the Leave It to Beaver era of the 1950s. Is that true?
100%. Oh, 100%. Yeah. And you're like, we've got phones, we're on the internet here. Like that. But I think it's more the shock of when that's your baseline and it begins to decline.
Well, I was thinking, we got married in 1990. I remember one of the purchases we made was a home computer, which was a thing in 1990. And it was $3,000 in 1990 dollars. Now, run that through some inflation calculator, that's probably $7,000, $8,000 today. Yes. Mark, if I dropped $7,000 or $8,000 on a computer today, I'd have a heart attack. It's like there's still anywhere between $1,200 and $3,000, depending on how torqued out you want the thing to be. So, as things are getting better, things are also getting worse. As things are getting worse, things are getting better. So the economy's broken. And I've asked this question before. I remember talking to Ken Costa, who was on the podcast last year, about this with the $1 trillion wealth transfer.
Mm.
But when you think about the only way you're getting into a house now is you're have a great job, or you have parents who are helping you. And that breaks down very quickly because most people don't have parents who can help them because their parents themselves are struggling in their 50s and 60s. And I wonder, are we moving back to a feudal society? You've got the $1 trillion wealth transfer. And basically, the premise of a feudal society is that a small concentration of people own everything. You look at private equity. Private equity didn't really exist 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It now owns so much. All the real estate in your neighborhood is being bought up in the houses by private equity. Businesses, your local plumbing repair person, probably going to get bought out by private equity. I was reading a piece the other day about fire trucks. Apparently, it is very hard to get a fire truck in the United States. And the reason is they used to be independently manufactured locally. You'd have a fire truck factory in Indiana, another one in Montana, another one in Georgia, et cetera. Private equity got into the game about a decade ago, bought up all these small companies. Now they've jacked the prices, stripped the companies, and you got to wait. And you got like two models. It's like Boeing and Airbus basically rule the skies, right? As far as aircraft manufacturers go. And you're going to see that more and more. And that means it's harder and harder to really get a start in the world. I'd love any thoughts you have on, are we going back into a feudal era or a robber baron era?
Mm-hmm. I think so. And the robber baron's another good analogy of this moment, So, there's two books. Joel Kotkin, he's sort of on the right, and then Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist, is sort of he's on the left. Have both said that this is happening, and they've called it, I think Kotkin calls it neo-feudalism, and Yanis Varoufakis calls it techno-feudalism. And okay. I like that idea. And he says that, in a sense, the feudal baron, you lived on their land. You were like it was a rentier, thing. So you paid rents for everything. And that's increasingly happening,
And you brought them your crops, right?
Yes, exactly. And we do that now with the internet. Apps are increasingly rental things. They're talking about you won't own a car in the future. You'll rent a sort of autonomous vehicle.
Yeah, BMW trying to charge you for your seat heaters a couple of years ago. Remember that? It's like a monthly subscription. Jeep is now running ads on your home on that display in your Jeep. They're running ads on it. It's like, no, I just want Google Maps. Like, get out of my car. Sorry, just an interjection there.
Totally, it's and Yanis Varoufakis even goes as far, and he's a left winger, and he got like really hit by the left. He would argue that it's not capitalism anymore. Because in capitalism, there's competition. And he talks about, Amazon. So he says, imagine going to a village where you walk in and there's a butcher and a baker and a grocer, and everyone is owned by the same business who's setting the same prices. And this is increasingly what's happening with Amazon, and things like Temu and Shein that China has built is really them trying to build a version of that to undercut Amazon. And so, this is why Trump also banned, one of the first things he did was ban packages or something from the post office under $500. Like the post office in the US stopped for a while. This was purely because of the way that Temu was undercutting Amazon. So there's this interesting dynamic where, I think we're heading into this. I mean, the wealth transfer from 2020 to now is phenomenal. And you're 100% right. These firms like Blackstone, Vanguard, they're just buying up absolutely everything. So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer is a dynamic that you see in a feudal society. And going back just real quickly to the robber baron era, which is at the end of the 19th century in the US, I just read.
And that's what? Big oil, big railway, big steel.
DuPont, JP Morgan, these people, Matthew Josephson wrote a book about that called The Robber Barons. I think in 1932, I just reread that, and it felt very similar to now. An expansive US, taking the Panama Canal, Puerto Rico, Philippines. We're returning to some sort of era that has the parallels to that, I think.
So this can be very depressing. If you did not have depression and anxiety prior to turning on this podcast, you now have it. But I wanted to have this conversation, number one, because I am sensing there's something really going on, but it's really hard to figure it out day to day. Nobody does this better than you do, Mark. What have we not talked about in terms of the shifts that we're seeing? We talked about political, we talked about geography, we talked about economics, talked about feudalism, monarchical tendencies. What else are you seeing?
The thing we're missing in the midst of this is a spiritual awakening that's happening. We hinted a little bit there. The spiritual journey that people like Joe Rogan have gone on, is all of it positive? No. But all of a sudden in the mainstream, you have people talking about psychedelics and mushrooms and spiritual
microdosing.
Massive. UFOs, UAPs have gone from this fringe thing to now being spoken about in Senate subcommittees, and even following the conversation around that. And again, too, this just sounds wacky. I'm just going to say that. But you've got like the Silicon Valley guys are into this. This is a huge cultural phenomenon now. And the UFO conversation's gone from, or UAP conversation's gone from, oh, wow, here's this video that a American fighter pilot took of this tic-tac like drone thing, to we're now summoning these orbs. The whole conversation has gone around. It now looks like the New Age movement and psychic movement, or even spiritualism in the 19th century. So I just was seeing a photo online of an event at the Esalen retreat in Big Sur, which has been so influential throughout American history, of like the human potential movement, meditation, yoga, all this sort of stuff, Gestalt psychology. And, there's all these intelligence officers and like celebrities and psychologists summoning orbs, psychically to come and visit them.
What does that mean? Sorry, I'm not familiar with that. And also, can you just define UAP? I'm still learning that it's not UFOs anymore. They just changed the etymology.
Yeah, so it's unidentified aerial phenomenon is what it is. And, so basically in 2017, there was an article in the New York Times by, I think it was Blumenthal and Leslie Kean and these people, which is like, the government is seeing, these things, and they don't know what they are. And there's a whole bunch of conjecture. Is this just a cover for military tech and so on? But this conversation has just grown. So you now have members of Congress and Senate who are deep believers, and of the US intelligence and military industrial complex, who are deep believers that there are UFOs or UAPs out there. They're trying to contact us. And if you follow this conversation, which is getting bigger and bigger, they're on Joe Rogan, they're on all these podcasts. The conversation, just the last little bit, has gone from here's a ship landing to the literal language is these are angelic and demonic beings. They're interdimensional. They're not from other planets, and we need to spiritually connect with them. And I've seen video.
So sorry. Let me just stop you. Angelic and demonic, like these aren't just neutral forces, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They're angelic and demonic forces that many people are saying we're actually being visited by.
Yes, this is the language now. So someone like Dan Pasolka, who's a religious sociologist who wrote this book, American Cosmic. And people like her have taken this towards a spiritual direction. So it's no longer, like Farmer Joe has a UFO land in his field. It's now, a bunch of Silicon Valley people and CIA agents and others like having circles at Big Sur to summon orbs by psychically connecting with them. This is a big deal now. And you've got members of Congress who are having subcommittees. I'm not sure if she's a congresswoman or a senator, Luna, I've forgotten her first name, and she's got this disclosure thing where they're going to release the secrets on JFK and MLK and RFK's assassinations and UFOs, So there's serious believers. Is it a UFO religion? I don't know. But what it is it's a further evidence that in the culture, the spiritual conversation. So you just say you're a 26-year-old guy and you listen to the podcast that everyone else does. You're now listening to podcasts on Joe Rogan about ancient civilization apocalypses, which Graham Hancock. Then you listen to next week and it's someone talking about the spiritual experiences they had on Ayahuasca. And then the next week you're talking about people summoning orbs and UAPs. Like this is full mystical, spiritual world stuff, And alongside that, the Times in London just had a series on Gen Z, and, they had one over the weekend but Gen Z, spirituality, like they see themselves increasingly as very spiritual and very religious.
Yeah.
And, it was a fascinating article because it was written by a millennial and who'd sort of deconstructed. And she was then trying to deal with the fact that Gen Z was going to church and was like just totally normal about it. And, had some of my friends' churches, these young people were going to, and sort of like this very alive, Christian scene that's growing in London and the UK. And so, in the midst of this, I know, and for years, my sort of mantra has been that, yes, things might get worse, but when things get worse socially, that's also the moment in the midst of these confluence of changes that spiritual renewals and awakenings happen. When people stop looking to the idols of the age and they start looking to God, when their sources of stability are gone, that creates a spiritual existential conversation. And I think we're 100% seeing that. So I believe in the midst of this, there is this tremendous spiritual opportunity going on. And I think we can miss that in the midst of it. We get so thrown by all these trends, but in the midst of it, there is, we've seen this massive delegitimization of institutions. And when that happens, people are going to start to look for meaning somewhere. I think it's George Hunter said, look for the gaps between idols. When people's belief in that idol fails, they're going to pick up a new one at some stage, but there's a period of disequilibrium where they're looking for something. There are millions in that place now. And we're finding in our church, we're just getting people walking off the street, coming in, asking questions that I would have never thought would be asked. They're having spiritual experiences. Increasingly, churches are having people turning up asking for deliverance ministry, and even in churches with no tradition of deliverance ministry, because these spiritual realities are now part of the mainstream culture. You may not see that if you read the New York Times, or listen to CNN, but if you're on Joe Rogan and all these things, you're seeing this.
So I want to go there in a minute, but first I want to touch on one other thing I've really seen. I mean, there's an argument, and I think it's a fairly plausible argument. We bounced off this whole conversation in the last hour, but the role of the new media. So even the New York Times would say sort of established left-wing media institution of the U.S. It's like Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, Dave Ramsey has 20 million people listening to him every week. Theo Vaughn, that won the election. That's where the election was won and lost in the new media, basically podcasts. Do you want to talk a little bit about YouTube, social media influencers, and where media is going? I mean, we've been talking about this under the surface for a decade now, but it seems like the scales have tipped. I'd love your take on that about the new media.
Yeah, I mean, personal thing, and you might have had this as well. I had this sort of shock moment. I grew up watching TV here in Australia and the news, and we have SBS, which is we've got two government channels. SBS is a bit like PBS or something, and they've got some news programs that they put on, and their viewership has declined. And so I was maybe about 6 months ago, I was looking at, just came up on something, ratings, for some of these news shows that are produced by our tax dollar. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, it was tiny. I was surprised. And then the next thing was like, hang on, Rebuilders probably has more listeners than this show.
Yes.
And it just shocked me, because I'm like, I just go to my studio and I'm talking about stuff. And I'm like, and what plan? I would have, if you'd said to me at 16, Mark, one day you'll have a larger audience than this show. I'm just like, that is mind-blowing to me. And, how on what planet? And look, it's cheap, is it? I mean, you've obviously got to pay the equipment, but look here, I'm on my iPhone earphones here on a Mac. It's not exorbitant, and the fact that you could do that. So that's completely changed everything. The one thing I would say, though, is there is that reality. So there's the, Andrew King called it the culture of the amateur. Amateurs like us, in a way, can do this now. But then there's another side of it that I think also what you did see was the podcast world and ecosystem politically is also deeply aligned to Silicon Valley. So in a sense, you had this battle like Randolph Hearst, in that robber baron period, was owning newspapers and controlling media and so on. Rupert Murdoch, who is one of the world's sort of big media barons, owns Fox News. He, is an Australian, but he gave up his Australian citizenship to become an American because there's particular laws that only Americans can own certain media things. That's to protect influence coming into the country. Podcasts destroy that, So Elon Musk, we're about to announce our election here. All the commentary about the Australian election is, will Musk basically get himself involved in the local election? So Elon Musk on his phone, in between sending off a rocket, can fire off a tweet, and that has so much influence in our Australian election. And it's happening in Germany, it's happening in Britain, blah, blah. So my sense is that some of those podcasts, though, that you just mentioned, not Dave Ramsey, but sort of some of the Joe Rogan and Theo Von, they're also the voices or the newspapers, if you like, of Silicon Valley. And it's the people networks. So also what podcasts also show is the power of networks. So like many of the people you'd have on, you just mentioned Ken Costa. I know Ken. So we're all in these.
Oh, yeah. Everybody knows everybody at a certain level in your field. It's absolutely true.
So they're force multipliers of network dynamics of who you know. But I think that we're not fully here yet. I mean, you saw after the election, MSNBC's ratings plummet, CNN's plummeted. And I think there was a breaking of trust. I think what that wasn't a bunch of Trump people who were watching MSNBC. That was a large part of the audience who either were like, I'm done, I can't follow this anymore, it's exhausting. Or you told me that Trump was going to lose. You told me this was going to happen, and you guys were so off. I do not trust you as a news source anymore. So there's something in the personal, and it's been interesting too. I'm sure you felt it too, that, I meet people, I can go to another country and people come up and they're like, I feel like I know you because they've walked around their lake with me in their ears. And there's a trust element with podcasts, I think, as well, which can be exploited. We're trying to follow Jesus here and we're trying to be authentic in this and be ourselves. But then there's other forces which can use that authenticity and long-term. So I think that the revolution of media is not done yet. And it's going to be even more transformative. Will some of these legacy media be around in 10 years? I mean, interesting. The New York Times, the one side of it, I subscribe to the New York Times. I'm in Australia. I got a cheap overseas deal. One reason I did is they're reporting on what's happening in Rwanda or, Burma. Is no one's doing that. So they can only report, that they can send foreign correspondents. And I think that's really important to still have, because the danger is there's just going to be a bunch of podcasts talking about Silicon Valley stuff.
Yeah, with a whole bunch of bros just talking about whatever they happen to think. No, I'm worried about that too. We had a plane crash in Toronto earlier this year, the first in years and years and years. And I mean, I turned to the local papers, which are actually digital, but there were AI-generated fakes within hours. There was like using social media to figure out what really happened is good and bad. You did get some direct videos from the scene, but then within hours, there was AI fake videos from the scene. And so I kind of turned to the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, our New York Times, our, USA Today, not really, but that's like, okay, they have actual journalists on the ground reporting probably what is reasonably, did this happen, did this not happen? And I'm like, what happens when there's no economic model for that? Because I'm not sending reporters on the field. I don't know whether you are. I don't think Rogan is. And so when old media completely dies, truth is going to be harder than ever to discern. We may go back to a pre-literate culture where you don't actually, if you think about the communication revolution that happened with the printing press and the newspapers and everything, if you lived 700 years ago, you didn't know what was happening in another village, let alone another country. Or, you read Neil Postman amusing ourselves to death. Prior to the invention of the telegraph, the King of England might have died, but you wouldn't find out if you lived in Nebraska until perhaps 2 months after the king died.
Yes. And this was McLuhan, yeah.
Yeah, McLuhan too. So yeah, I think no answers, just this is happening in real time. So when you're the pastor of a local church, this frames the anxiety and depression and the unsettling that this is what you're preaching into every week. This is what you're feeling as a leader. This is what you're preaching into every week. And people can't articulate it. They might not be able to define it, but this is the pressure that shows up when they look at their bank accounts, when they go to work, when they think about having kids, when they're trying to make rent or think about one day possibly ever buying a house or affording a car. This is what's going on in the real world. So, and the best thing is you're also a pastor, believe it or not, talking to you. I do wonder whether you're an AI. I know we've hung out in real life, but I don't know how, we've talked about this in previous episodes, how you collate all this information, but it is remarkable. But in your new work, from platform to pillars, you talk about a different, and the new work isn't so much about what we have talked about for the last hour, but Give us the thesis of what you're hoping to see. And this is a note of hope for Christians and a path forward.
Yeah. So in a background, it was. So in a sense, I was like, I can see these changes coming. We're moving from a culture which was shaped by institutions to one shaped by digital platforms. But what is the real world implications of that for ordinary people living in this world? And what I realized is it's pitched a vision of what it is to be successful. And that's, in a sense, to live on a platform. It's a intensified form of individualism. And the sort of new social contract is, okay, well, we can't necessarily provide you a home or this or that, but what we can provide you is a platform to be seen, to be heard, to be known. And, this has radically changed ordinary life, but it's also radically changed leadership. And I know there's many, many leaders who listen to this podcast. So leadership's gone from something which emerges from a long process of development, the development of your character, of knowing people, of being proven, of perhaps working your way up an organization through being a person of trust, integrity, character, to you can short circuit that. Like we said, you can be the pastor bro with a podcast and just get a massive following. And so instead of like influence has been equated with followership then equals influence. And I began to think about, okay, I just kept hearing platform everywhere. Well, there's even books sort of arguing, like, if you want to be a leader today, first develop a platform to get your message out. So in a sense, it disconnects you from, hey, we listen to that guy's content because he's shown amongst us that he has character. So, you think about to be, a leader, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you maybe, if you're a pastor, you had a large church, an influential church, or you're a theologian, or you're the head of a seminary or a parachurch organization, or, connected some way. And there's now sort of like a shortcut to that. So I thought about this architecturally, like, what is a platform? Why is everyone talking about this? And a platform ultimately is an architectural structure that's a stage. And a stage was created by the ancient Greeks to give a little rise so that a speaker could speak in their public spaces. And there was sort of a sense where the platform lent authenticity to that person. It said that their content is important. This is an important person. And what's happened in our age is that we've had the platform has been offered to everyone. And I also began to then think about this, and I thought, well, this is really interesting because it disconnects from character. Because I can put here this fantastic presentation online and people think, what a fantastic guy. But you might come and the people in my church or the people in my neighborhood or the people I work with think I'm, an absolute fool, or a person who is, not of integrity, not of character. And I looked back, I think, on a lot of the leadership failures in the tragedy, has also occurred around the time of the promotion of platform as a shortcut to leadership. And so, that's the essential idea that I began to sort of think we need to unpick this, both socially as individuals and also as a model of leadership. This idea of platform has to be pulled apart. Now, there is a reality to each platform. Like, there is a thing. You and I have a platform. We can go on here and people will listen. But I think that disconnected from anything else, the idea of platform has increasingly become toxic. And you mentioned before, those podcasts, the influence of the politics, it really is ultimately about platform, this dynamic. So it's had a huge effect on our world.
And, I've reflected on this because we have a pretty young audience. We hear from a ton of young leaders. And a question I've gotten over the last 5-10 years is how do I build a platform? And I think you quote this in your book, From Pillars to Platform. But when Tim Keller died, I wrote something about, most of the people I know who are my age or older didn't set out to build a platform. They did really meaningful work, and the platform kind of built itself. Wow, there's something significant happening in New York. There's something, when I heard Mark, I really liked it. But it's like, yeah, you have a good studio and you're on YouTube and you have nice graphics and some podcast theme music, but you weren't like, how do we build an empire? You're just like, hey, here's some thoughts. And, it kind of built out. And I've thought about the fact, like, I'm still here in my basement, north of Toronto, doing this interview, and I have more listeners than a lot of mainstream broadcast things. It's crazy. But I also I also, so commenting on that, like you're not trying to build a platform, just trying to do meaningful work, and the platform kind of builds itself. Now, am I happier with more listeners and viewers than less? Yes. Yeah. I would rather a bigger audience than no audience or a smaller audience. So full disclosure. On the other hand, if this had happened to me in my 30s, I think I would have been roadkill. I am very grateful that this happened to me in my 40s and my 50s, not in my 30s, because I did not have the character. And I pray every day, I hope I have the character to sustain what God is doing right now in this moment. But like if your platform outruns your character, that's a recipe for a life implosion. And, Mark, we've hung out in real life too. I see you as very level-headed, very thoughtful. What if this had happened to you at 18? What if you're Mr. Beast? Like, and he seems to be handling it okay, I think. But like, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if this had come earlier, I wouldn't been able to handle it. I've said to people before, I'm glad my first couple books didn't become bestsellers because, you couldn't handle it. And, there's something that, I think when I think about what's happened with rebuilders, like there's an element that we always talk about that it comes from our experience at the local church, and it sort of began to take off really when, and even before Rebuilders did this cultural moment with John Mark Comer, and, it was really our reflections of trying to do church in these very secular cities, reflecting on it, and, it wasn't just, there's almost this idea of content as disconnected from real life, so if I just come up with this great content, but I think great content emerges from someone who lives in a real place, in a real time, and has learnt these wisdom. So there's a difference between wisdom and content, in a sense. So like with Rebuilders, there's an element where we're always trying to apply wisdom to it. So, with our last episode, we did an update on all the stuff happening in the world. But at the end, I tried to orientate, like if you're feeling punch drunk by this moment, here's actually how you can center yourself on what God is doing at the very end. Always trying to tie it back. So, for us with Rebuilders, we started in COVID, and we were recording during COVID, and we're like 2 weeks ahead, like, this is what we're thinking about, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're trying to rebuild our church. We kept going through seasons of difficulty and struggle. And my heart is warmed less by, it's even the same. It's always great to say, wow, this many people are listening. It's fantastic. If it was 12 people listening, I wouldn't bother, because it's like a lot of, the energy level to do.
It's a lot of work. Yeah.
And, but it's what we realized is for pastors, your average pastors out there is 80 to 150 people. They're never going to have a platform. They're being faithful. And we see that, like, if I can save people through, I'm interested in culture and the news. This is what I do fun, This is not me spending an hour a week. This is me just following the news. I always have. I read books as fun about this stuff. It's just a natural outflow of how God's made me. So if I can take that gift, give it to people, but be rooted in wisdom, that's really key. And this ties into the counterpoint that I bring up in the book of a pillar. So of a platform. It's like, I thought we have to, what's a biblical way of living? And I thought of another architectural structure, and it just dawned on me one day that there's this biblical analogy, which has always sort of tantalized me, of the living temple, that Jerusalem temple falls, and Jesus talks about, this creating this living temple in the world. So I thought about that. I thought, wow, there's this living temple being built in the world, and there's this idea in the scriptures of pillars, and I began to think, what if that's a sort of counterpoint to this? And I thought about a pillar. When someone who has invested in a community, basically, like, has lived well, they often describe them as a pillar of a community.
You're right.
And, that's something that I wanted to live towards, to have as an aspiration. And, I realized that pillars are strong, they are resilient, they work in unison with others. And in a sense, they create space. An architectural pillar creates space to have sort of, a place where people can meet in a building. And, I realized that, that's a much more aspirational model for people than to build a platform. So, I had this thought, like, what if the church leaders encourage them to be pillars? If we did that for the long haul, building credibility over time, maybe that's just going to be in a town of 3,000 people. That's actually, I think, a far more biblical motif than a platform.
Yeah, and pillars don't move. I'm not saying you can't learn and grow and change and mature, but I think about my father. One of the things in 85 years I'm so amazed about with him is he's always been a kind, generous, good man. If he became angry, bitter, frustrated, volatile, I would be like, oh, the pillar just collapsed. And I think we need more pillars in the world. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, and I'm not saying people can't change their political allegiance or can't change their mind or they get reconverted. But, if you're a Christian or you're a pastor, you're a leader, people are looking for something that is trustworthy.
Yes.
And, I think that's what you hint at in the book, is that what if Christians were beacons of virtue? And if you look at the spread of the early church, you see that these were people who cared for people that other people forgot. These were people who loved and who saw the world very differently than the culture around them. And, with people having more spiritual curiosity, wouldn't it be great if we had more pillars? And, the more things change, the more you need something to stay the same. Mission of the church doesn't change. The gospel doesn't change. Is that what you're driving at, kind of? That's a very loaded question, but take it where you want.
There was a great little video I saw recently and there's an Australian rapper who just came to faith. And he talked about, and he was shocked. Like there was a sort of big podcast there where the person is on television. And in Australia, this is not normal. Like I know in the United States, stuff like this happens. To see someone talk about faith on TV is so jarring. And, he's led quite a rough life. And in the middle of the interview, the guy's like, what do you want to do with your life?
He just said, I want to live to glorify God. And it was shocking. And you can see that the interviewer was surprised. And he's like, wow, I didn't know you were religious. And he basically said, I was so anti-religious. And one of his friends came to faith. And it was deeply shocking for his group of friends. And the sort of witness of this guy, his complete transformation as a person, was what shook this Australian rapper, completely not typical person who had come to faith. And this has now led him to Christ. And I think we've forgotten that, like the power of a life lived well, a life lived for Christ. And I think in all of this cultural tumult that was spoken about, I think it's when people live like pillars, it's going to be an increasingly luminous thing. When everything is unstable, they're going to look for places of strength, of resilience, of support. And I also realized that what pillars do in the living temple metaphor that the scriptures use is that they actually create space for the presence of God. And I think people are desperate for, an encounter with God. If Augustine's, corrected his assessment, which I think he is, their hearts are sort of homeless until they find, themselves back in God. Encountering the presence of God, I think, is going to be increasingly something that churches need to build themselves around going forward.
Well, and that's how we trace out hope for the future. Mark, I feel like we've just dipped our thimble in the ocean, but this has been really helpful, alarming, and reassuring at the same time. But here we are in this moment, and, I don't want to be trite, but God knows exactly what's going to happen. Placed you here for a reason. You were born in the year you were born, I believe, for a particular reason, and your framing is so helpful. The book is called From Platforms to Pillars. The podcast is Rebuilders. Highly, highly recommend everybody listening subscribe to it, because if you enjoyed today, you're going to love that podcast. And Mark, anything else you want to direct leaders' attention to before we go, or where to find you online?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me online. I would just add one word of hope as well. I think that problems come before creative solutions. And I think that the people of God are positioned, I know there's pastors listening, but also people in other fields listen to your podcast. Yeah. We need economic solutions. We need political solutions, community solutions, social solutions. So I'm excited what the people of God are going to do, empowered by the Holy Spirit in this moment. So, feel free to check out my stuff, but I'm also championing and cheering you on and praying for you all as we step into this moment with God.
Here's the cool thing about talking to you. When we had lunch in Melbourne a year ago, we had a whole other narrative set out for a podcast. So that'll be next time, maybe, if we're all still here. Just so good to talk today. Thank you, Mark.
No worries. My pleasure.